Have you ever imagined what it would be like to be born knowing that the world wants you gone? Well, that was my reality. My name is Moses, and my first breath came under a death sentence. I was born at a time when the heart of Egypt, led by Pharaoh, beat with fear and hatred for my people, the Hebrews. Pharaoh, feared by all, had ordered the death of all Hebrew male babies, yes, just for being who we were. My mother, a woman of incredible strength and courage, did not accept this. Passively, she hid me from everyone's eyes for 3 months. Imagine that. 3 months without making any noise that could give me away. No loud cries, no baby laughter, nothing that could attract attention. It was a daily struggle against fear. But a mother's love does these things, makes the impossible seem like just another day. However, the time came when she saw that she could no longer keep this secret. Every cry, every laugh, every sound I made, like any baby, was a risk, a real danger, not only to me, but to my entire family. With a broken heart, she made a decision that only desperation and love together could justify. She placed me in a basket. It wasn't just any basket. It was an ark made of reeds, carefully prepared and waterproofed with tar and pitch. She placed me in the waters of the Nile River, the same river that gave life to Egypt, but at that moment seemed like an uncertain path between life and death. My mother's heart must have been heavy as she watched me float downstream, surrendering my fate to the unknown. And here's the craziest part of this story. Pharaoh's daughter, the princess of Egypt, was bathing in the river when she noticed the basket. Curious, she sent one of her servants to fetch it. Imagine the daughter of the man who wanted me dead, holding my fate in her hands. When she opened the basket and saw me, something incredible happened. She didn't see me as a threat or a problem, but as a baby in need of care and love. Perhaps it was divine providence or just pure humanity, but she decided to save me. She adopted me as her own son within Pharaoh's palace. Yes, I grew up in the heart of the most dangerous place for a Hebrew. And believe me, the story doesn't stop there. My older sister Miriam, who had followed the basket from a distance, witnessing everything unfold, had the courage to approach the princess. She suggested that a Hebrew woman, who by God's permission was our mother, could nurse and care for me. And so, in a way that can only be described as a miracle, my mother not only saved me but was also chosen to raise me under the guise of a wet nurse. I grew up between two worlds, learning the customs of the Egyptians while hearing the whispers of the teachings and culture of my people, the Hebrews. Those years shaped my identity and prepared my heart for the struggles I would face in the future. All this under Pharaoh's nose. The days in the palace were a mixture of luxury and constant learning. But the weight of my true heritage never left my heart. Each passing day, I, Moses, became more aware of my Hebrew origin, even while living as an Egyptian prince. It was during one of those days, when I was already a grown man, that everything changed drastically. I decided to step out from the golden shadows of the palace and walk among my true people, and what I saw forever changed the course of my life. As I walked disguised among the Hebrews, I saw up close the brutality and injustice with which they were treated. They were forced to work to exhaustion under Egypt's scorching sun, their bodies and spirits worn down by the endless tyranny of the Egyptian taskmasters. It was then, in one of those moments of anguished observation, that I witnessed an act of cruelty that ignited a burning fury within me. A particular Egyptian taskmaster was punishing a Hebrew, one of my brothers, without any mercy. With each blow that descended upon the weak and defenseless man, I felt as if each lash was striking my own flesh. My anger grew, boiling inside me, like a storm ready to explode. In an impulse I couldn't control, I quickly approached the scene. My breath was heavy, and each step I took seemed to echo like distant thunder. The Egyptian barely noticed my presence, so engrossed was he in his own savage fury. Without thinking of the consequences, without pondering my position or the future, I acted driven by a force greater than reason. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I confronted the aggressor. Our eyes met, and the hatred and surprise I saw reflected in his only fueled my anger. With a swift and fateful blow, carrying the full weight of my despair and rage, I struck the Egyptian. He fell lifeless, an abrupt silence filling the space where only pain and suffering had been heard before. The Hebrew he was mistreating looked at me, his eyes wide with both fear and gratitude. There was no time for words, only actions. With the same speed that anger had taken hold of me, the fear of what I had just done set in. I had taken a life, an action that would bring immense consequences, not just for me, but for all Hebrews. I quickly looked around. The area was isolated, away from prying eyes, but I knew this wouldn't last. In haste, I dragged the Egyptian's body to a more hidden spot and began digging in the hot sand. Each handful of sand I threw over him seemed to bury a part of me as well, my innocence and the life I had known until then. After hiding the body, I paused for a moment, sweat mixing with sand and tears on my face. What had I done? I had saved a brother, yes, but at the cost of a life. The weight of this decision crushed me, and I knew I could no longer return to the palace and pretend nothing had happened. In the days that followed, the fear of being discovered consumed me. I was now both a prince and a fugitive, a savior and a murderer. The duality of my existence haunted me, and I knew my fate was sealed. My life in Egypt as a prince was over, and I needed to flee, not just for my safety, but to begin the journey I was destined to follow. After that fateful encounter, which sealed the taskmaster's fate by my own hands, anguish and fear took hold of me. I, Moses, raised within the walls of Pharaoh's palace, now found myself forced to flee, leaving behind everything I knew. I knew that if my act were discovered, there would be no mercy, not even for the adopted son of the princess. So, without looking back, I made the decision to hide in the vast and unknown lands of Midian. The journey was arduous and lonely. The desert landscape stretched before me, a sea of sand and heat under the relentless sun. As I walked, my heart was heavy with guilt and uncertainty about the future. Yet I knew this journey was necessary, not just for my safety, but perhaps as part of a greater purpose, which I did not yet understand. Upon reaching Midian, exhausted and worn from the journey, I encountered a scene that would once again test my courage. Near a well, I saw a group of women trying to draw water while a group of rude and brutish shepherds drove them away, preventing them from watering their flocks. The call for justice, so strong in my heart, resurged with vigor. Without hesitation, I intervened. Perhaps it was divine justice guiding me, or perhaps the simple impulse to help those in need. With determination, I faced the shepherds, driving them away with the same strength I had once used to protect one of my own people. The women, daughters of Jethro, looked at me with a mixture of surprise and gratitude, astonished to see a stranger defending their cause. Once the shepherds were dispersed, I helped Jethro's daughters draw the necessary water for the flocks. At that moment, I felt a peace that had long eluded my heart. For a brief instant, the shadows of my past seemed less oppressive, and a glimpse of hope appeared on the arid horizon of Midian. When Jethro, the priest of Midian and father of the women I helped, learned of what had happened, he immediately invited me to his home. His hospitality was generous and sincere, an oasis of kindness amid the desert of my own turmoil. In his home, I found not only refuge but also a chance for redemption. Jethro was a wise and understanding man, and under his guidance, I began to learn about the people of Midian and their traditions. Over time, the tension I carried began to dissipate, and in Jethro, I found a mentor and a friend. His family welcomed me as one of their own, and in their home, I finally found a sense of belonging that had long been missing. The most surprising part of this new chapter was when Jethro offered me the hand of his daughter, Zipporah, in marriage. Zipporah, a woman of strong spirit and kind heart, accepted me despite the shadows that accompanied my past. Together, we began to build a life in Midian, far from the persecutions of Egypt. Marrying Zipporah was a seal of my new identity and life in Midian. With her by my side and with Jethro's support, I began to tend the flocks, living a simple and peaceful life that contrasted sharply with my past in the palace. Each day that passed, I felt more integrated and accepted, further from the man I had been and closer to the man I was meant to be. In retrospect, I see my flight to Midian not as an act of cowardice, but as a necessary step in my journey. Life in Midian had become peaceful, a safe haven from the ghosts of my past. Years went by as I tended Jethro's flocks, learning the ways of the desert, its storms and its calms. Each day was filled with the rustic simplicity of shepherding, far from the intrigues and opulence of Egypt. However, on a seemingly ordinary day, while leading the flocks through the desert, something extraordinary happened that would change my life forever. I had decided to take the flock to Mount Horeb, a place the locals respected and feared for its ancient stories. The sun was high, and the desert silence was broken only by the sound of hooves and the occasional bleating of sheep. As I walked, lost in thoughts about my life and everything I had left behind, I noticed a strange light in the distance. A light that did not seem natural. As I approached, I saw something that defied all logic and understanding. A small, twisted bush was on fire, but it wasn't an ordinary fire. The flames engulfed the plant without consuming it. Curious and a bit apprehensive, I drew near, attracted by the phenomenon as if an invisible force pulled me closer. It was then that I heard a voice coming from the midst of the fire, a powerful and commanding voice that resonated with authority and warmth. "Moses! Moses!" it called, and trembling I could only respond, "Here I am." The voice identified itself as the God of my ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The ground I stood on, in front of that burning bush, became sacred, and I removed my sandals in respect and awe. The air was charged with the divine presence, and I felt completely exposed, as if that purifying fire could see through my soul. God then spoke of the suffering of my people in Egypt, how he had heard their cries and was determined to set them free. And to my surprise and fear, he said that I would be the instrument of that liberation. "I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." The weight of this mission seemed overwhelming. I, who had fled Egypt to escape death, was now to return and confront Pharaoh himself. Doubts assailed me. Who was I for such a task? And why would God choose a fugitive, a man without influence or power? But God, knowing my heart and hesitations, assured me of his presence. He promised to be with me, giving me signs and words to speak. More than that, he gave me a clear mission and a purpose beyond any personal ambition: to liberate a people from slavery. As I walked away from the burning bush, the fire still burned but did not consume. It was a lasting sign of God's promise and his enduring presence. With uncertain steps, yet motivated by a newfound strength, I returned to camp, aware that my life would never be the same. This experience at Mount Horeb was not just a divine encounter, but a calling that redefined my identity and destiny. I was scared, yes, but also inspired and transformed. Equipped with God's promise and the fire of his justice burning in my heart, I was ready to face whatever came, knowing I was no longer alone. The revelation at the burning bush was the beginning of a new journey, but my heart still wavered under the weight of the divine mission. I, Moses, had been chosen to free my people from Egypt, a task that seemed beyond my capabilities. How could I, who fled to avoid death, now face Pharaoh, the most powerful man in Egypt? How could I, with my hesitant speech and heavy tongue, persuade a people to follow me? As I wrestled with these doubts, I returned to God's presence, seeking answers and perhaps secretly a way to escape this overwhelming responsibility. "Lord," I said, my voice trembling as much as my heart, "what if they do not believe me or listen to my voice? What if they say the Lord did not appear to you?" God's response was not a rebuke, but a demonstration of power and promise. To dispel my doubts and strengthen my faith, He granted me miraculous signs. "What is that in your hand?" God asked, referring to the staff I held. "A staff," I replied, still uncertain of the purpose of the question. "Throw it on the ground," He instructed. I obeyed, and to my astonishment and fear, the staff turned into a serpent. I instinctively drew back, but God encouraged me to grab it by the tail. When I did, it turned back into a staff in my hand. This first sign was a clear message. The divine power would be with me, turning the ordinary into extraordinary. Not satisfied, God gave me a second sign. He asked me to place my hand on my chest. When I withdrew it, it was leprous, white as snow. A cold terror gripped me, but again He instructed, "Put your hand back into your cloak." I did as commanded, and upon withdrawing it, it was restored, as if it had never been afflicted. These miracles were irrefutable evidence of His power and presence with me. Even with such signs, my insecurity about speaking persisted. "O Lord," I pleaded, "I am not eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." The mission seemed to demand qualities I sincerely believed I lacked. God, in His infinite patience, responded to me. Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. His words should have been enough, but I still hesitated, overwhelmed by the fear of failure. Sensing my continued reluctance, God provided a final solution. "What about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you." Aaron would not only be my brother, but also my voice, the one who would speak for me when words failed. Me. God instructed that Aaron would be my spokesperson to the people. He would speak the words God gave me, and I would perform the signs before the people to demonstrate that the hand of the Almighty was working through us. With Aaron by my side, I felt a wave of relief and confidence. I would not be alone. I would have support, a companion in every challenging step ahead. Thus, with God's signs as my proof and Aaron as my voice, I felt a new strength arise within me. The journey ahead would be full of challenges, but now I had the certainty that it was not just my will, but God's will with me. Strengthened by these miracles and by my brother's presence, I turned my face toward Egypt, ready to fulfill my divine destiny, no longer as a doubtful man, but as a determined leader to free his people. After receiving the signs and God's assurance, I prepared to return to Egypt. My family, Zipporah, and our children would be by my side on this journey, which marked not only a physical return, but also the beginning of a divine mission. I, Moses, was determined, though I carried a mix of emotions, thinking about the challenges we would face. With Jethro's blessings and God's clear instructions still echoing in my mind, we set out into the unknown. The journey to Egypt was long and filled with reflections. I pondered God's words, the miracles I had witnessed, and the immense task ahead of me. Our journey was marked by stops at camps along the desert, where the vastness and solitude gave me space to meditate and pray. However, a disturbing incident came to shake the certainty I had begun to build. One night, at one of these camps, a terrible presence was felt. It was as if death itself was around us, an imminent danger that I could not comprehend. Suddenly, I felt gravely ill, as if my life was being drained from me. It was God coming to confront me. Zipporah, always perceptive and attuned to rites and traditions, sensed that something was profoundly wrong. She understood that this threat to my life was linked to a failing of ours. We had not circumcised our youngest son, an act fundamental before God and a sign of the covenant between him and our people. With a resolve that surprised me, Zipporah acted swiftly. She took a sharp stone and performed the circumcision on our son right there in the camp. Her determination and ability to act under pressure were our salvation in that moment of crisis. She applied the blood of the rite to my body as if to seal the covenant and appease divine wrath. After the rite, the sense of imminent death vanished as suddenly as it had arrived. I recovered, breathing with relief and renewed by knowing that Zipporah, my companion, had understood and accomplished what was necessary to protect our family and our mission. That incident was a stern reminder that my fidelity to God had to be complete, without failings or forgetfulness. Every detail of his law and commandments was essential, and I was being tested in my dedication and obedience. In the days that followed, as we continued our journey to Egypt, I reflected deeply on what had occurred. Zipporah's intervention not only saved me physically, but also strengthened my faith. She had been the guardian of the covenant in that critical moment, acting with courage and wisdom. As we reached the borders of Egypt, I felt a new layer of determination covering my previous doubts. The experience had transformed me, and I was ready to face Pharaoh, not just as an emissary of God, but as a leader who had learned the importance of every commandment and tradition. The return to Egypt, therefore, marked not only the beginning of the struggle for my people's freedom, but also a renewal of my personal covenant with God. With my family by my side, and with a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve and obey the divine, I was ready to challenge the chains of Egypt and bring freedom to the Israelites. The journey that began with uncertainties now continued, strengthened by faith and love, ready to face any challenge that awaited us. After the disturbing incident in the desert and the renewal of my faith, I, Moses, along with my brother Aaron, finally arrived in Egypt. Our hearts were heavy with the immensity of the task that awaited us, but at the same time, we were filled with the hope of freeing our people. The first step in our mission was to convince the elders of Israel that God had sent us and that his hand was upon us to guide our people to freedom. Aaron and I arranged a meeting with the elders, respected leaders among the Israelites, the guardians of our people's faith and tradition. The tension was palpable as we walked to the meeting. We knew words alone would not suffice. We needed to demonstrate clearly that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was with us. The meeting took place in a discreet location, away from Egyptian eyes. The elders gathered, their faces marked by years of slavery, eyes that carried a mix of hope and disillusionment. As they saw us, I noticed a spark of curiosity, perhaps even rekindled hope. Aaron, always eloquent, spoke first. With a firm voice, he narrated our extraordinary experience with the burning bush, how God had spoken to us and given us the mission to lead Israel to freedom. I watched him, proud of his ability to speak, his voice carrying the urgency and sincerity of our cause. Then it was time to show the signs God had given us. With my heart pounding, I took the staff in my hand and threw it to the ground before the elders. In an instant it transformed into a serpent, and I heard murmurs of amazement and admiration among them. One of the elders stepped back, his eyes fixed on the serpent moving on the ground. With divine permission, I grasped the serpent by the tail, and it turned back into a staff. The room was silent, everyone watching with intense attention. Next, I placed my hand on my chest and withdrew it, now leprous and white as snow. The elders leaned forward to see, some murmuring prayers and others simply speechless. After showing my restored hand, I looked at the faces of the elders. I could see the change in their expressions, from doubt to something that seemed to renew. Within them, faith. Aaron continued, explaining that these signs were proof that God was with us and that he had heard the cry of his people. The impact of these miracles was immediate and profound. The elders, men who had maintained our people's faith even under the brutality of slavery, now saw a promise of liberation. One by one they stood, their faces now marked not only by scars of the past, but by a new determination. They then spoke, their voices joining in a chorus of support. They promised to follow us, trusting that God had indeed sent us. The meeting ended with prayers and a shared feeling of renewed hope. They dispersed to spread the word among the people that liberation was near, that God had not forgotten his people. As I left that meeting, I felt a strength I hadn't possessed before. The acceptance and support of the elders not only validated our mission, but strengthened my own faith. I was ready, along with Aaron, to face what lay ahead. With God guiding us and our people now by our side, we were ready to challenge Pharaoh and claim the freedom that was our divine right. After rallying the support of the elders of Israel, I, Moses, along with my brother Aaron, were ready to face the greatest challenge yet, confronting the Pharaoh of Egypt. Our hearts were heavy, but driven by the unwavering faith that God was with us. We walked through the majestic corridors of the palace, a place I knew well, but now I walked as a messenger of God, no longer part of the Egyptian royalty. As we entered the throne room, the opulence of the surroundings starkly contrasted with the spiritual mission we carried. Pharaoh sat on his throne, surrounded by his advisors and guards. Authority and power emanated from him, and the weight of his gaze upon us was almost palpable. Aaron, by my side, took a deep breath, sharing the tension of the moment. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, so they may hold a festival to me in the desert. Aaron spoke firmly, his voice echoing off the walls of the hall. I stood by his side, holding the staff that God had transformed before the elders, a symbol of the power that accompanied us. Pharaoh's reaction was one of disdain and arrogance. Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go, he replied, his voice filled with challenge and disbelief. His words fell upon us like stones, heavy and cold. Undeterred, we insisted, explaining the importance of obeying God's will and the consequences of disobedience. But Pharaoh's heart hardened even more. Instead of listening, he accused us of disrupting the Israelites' work, of being lazy and inciting disorder among the slaves. As punishment for our audacity, Pharaoh ordered the oppression of the Israelites to increase. He instructed his taskmasters to no longer provide straw for brickmaking, yet demanded that the daily quota of bricks remain the same. Let them go and gather straw for themselves, he declared with cruelty. The already exhausting task became nearly impossible, worsening. My people's suffering, leaving the palace, was somber. The weight of Pharaoh's refusal and the increased oppression felt overwhelming. When we met the Israelites, they confronted us, their faces marked by disillusionment and pain. May the Lord look upon you and judge, for you have made us odious in the eyes of Pharaoh and his servants, putting a sword in their hands to kill us, they said with resentment. Those words struck me deeply, making me question whether we had done the right thing in challenging Pharaoh. The pain of my people was now more intense because of our action. With a heavy heart, I turned to God in prayer, seeking guidance and strength. Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why did you send me? I cried in my anguish. Amid the despair, God's answer did not come immediately, leaving me in a state of reflection and waiting. I knew that each of our steps was being guided by a greater purpose, yet doubt and fear still haunted my mind. The journey we thought would be of liberation seemed to have become one of greater tribulation. However, despite the adversities, the faith that had sustained me thus far would not allow me to give up. I knew that God had a plan for his people, and I, Moses, had to stand firm as his servant, regardless of the challenges. With Aaron by my side and the power of God in the signs we had shown, we were ready to continue our mission, no matter the storms we would face. The struggle for Israel's freedom was just beginning, and I was determined to follow the path God had set for us. The confrontation with Pharaoh had reached a stalemate, and his refusal to free the people of Israel only hardened his heart. I, Moses, knew that the battle we would now face would be like no other. God had prepared a response to Pharaoh's obstinacy, a series of terrible events that would demonstrate his power over all the land of Egypt. The first plague was an ominous prelude to what was to come. I stood at the edge of the great Nile River, the beating heart of Egypt, the source of its wealth and life. With the staff in hand, I raised it under divine command and struck the waters. Immediately, the river that sustained an entire nation turned to blood. Fish died, the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink from its waters. The impact was devastating, but Pharaoh's heart remained unmoved. More plagues followed, each more severe than the last. Frogs emerged in countless numbers, invading homes and disturbing life with their incessant presence. Then clouds of gnats and swarms of flies covered the land, each creature marking God's sovereignty and the futility of the Egyptian gods. The fourth plague brought pestilence to the Egyptian livestock, an immense economic loss. But even this did not soften Pharaoh's heart. Then boils broke out, afflicting men and animals, the sores marking the Egyptians' flesh, a visible sign of divine wrath. Still, Pharaoh refused to relent. The sky then darkened with a hailstorm, like never seen before. Lightning split the sky as hailstones battered everything in their path, destroying crops and livestock, bringing despair and destruction. This was followed by a locust invasion that consumed what little vegetation remained, leaving the land bare and the people desolate. The penultimate plague was a dense darkness that fell over Egypt, a darkness that could be felt, an oppressive shroud that lasted 3 long days. The Egyptians were immobilized by fear, while we, the Israelites, had light in our dwellings, a clear demonstration of the distinction God made between his people and the Egyptians. And finally came the most devastating plague of all, one that would break the stalemate once and for all. God announced that the death of the firstborns in all of Egypt would be the final blow. Anguish filled my heart as I conveyed this terrible news, but I knew it was part of the divine plan for my people's liberation. On that fateful night, while the Israelites marked their doors with the lamb's blood, so that the angel of death would pass over their homes, cries and lamentation rose from the heart of Egypt. Every Egyptian household lost its firstborn, from the child of the humble servant to Pharaoh's own heir. The pain and mourning that followed were indescribable, and finally, Pharaoh summoned me and Aaron in the middle of the night. His voice, broken by grief, ordered us to take our people and leave immediately. God's power had been demonstrated irrefutably, and our people's liberation was assured. As I led the Israelites out of Egypt, under the light of the full moon, I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow, of triumph and tremendous responsibility. The plagues were not just punishments. They were manifestations of God's power, stern reminders of his sovereignty and his covenant with Israel. As we marched toward freedom, I knew that each step we took was under divine providence, guiding us not only away from Egypt, but toward a promised destiny, marked by both challenges and hope. As the last and most fearsome of the plagues approached, I, Moses, felt the weight of an immense responsibility. God had given me clear instructions, not only to ensure our liberation, but to preserve the lives of our people. That night would not be just any night. It would be the night that defined our destiny as the chosen and marked people of God. I gathered all the elders of Israel and urgently conveyed the divine order. Each family was to take a lamb, an unblemished animal, and sacrifice it at twilight. The seriousness of the situation was etched on every face as the details of the sacrifice were carefully explained. "This is not just an act of faith," I said, "but a sign to the Lord, a shield against imminent destruction." I instructed each family to mark the doorposts of their homes with the lamb's blood. "When the angel of death passes over our homes, he will see the blood and pass over, sparing everyone inside," I explained. The blood would be our signal to the angel of death, a promise of protection and salvation. Additionally, each family was to eat the lamb's meat roasted over a fire, along with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. It was to be a meal of readiness, with sandals on their feet and staffs in their hands, ready to leave the moment freedom was granted. "Eat it in haste," I ordered, "for it is the Lord's Passover." That night, the heavy silence of expectation hung over Goshen, where our people resided. Families gathered in their homes, marked by the lamb's blood, shared the sacred meal, each aware of the power and promise that night held. It was a mix of fear and faith as we awaited the fulfillment of God's word. I myself, along with my family, watched the blood marks on our door, a visual reminder of the covenant between God and his people. The anxiety in every heartbeat was palpable as we prayed and waited, knowing that outside, divine judgment was being executed. And then, in the middle of the night, a terrible and piercing cry rose from all of Egypt. It was the sound of an entire nation in mourning, for there was not a single Egyptian house without someone dead, including Pharaoh's own son. Their sorrow was deep, but for us, it was the sign of our salvation and imminent freedom. Pharaoh, broken and defeated by God's mighty hand, summoned me and Aaron even before dawn. "Take your people and leave," he ordered. "Leave Egypt and serve your God as you have said." His voice was one of resignation, resistance finally overcome by divine force. With the order to depart finally given, I quickly mobilized the Israelites. We left Egypt in haste, a sea of freed people, carrying with us not only physical belongings, but a reinvigorated spirit of freedom and renewal. After the miraculous liberation, we, the people of Israel, left Egypt under divine leadership, carrying with us not only our belongings, but a new hope. However, this newly acquired freedom would soon be tested in ways we could never imagine. As we marched, I received word that Pharaoh, consumed by bitter remorse and anger, had changed his mind and was mobilizing his army to recapture us. As the distant sound of Egyptian war chariots began to grow audible, a collective anxiety spread among the people. We were caught between the relentless desert and the vast Red Sea, an obstacle that seemed insurmountable. My heart was heavy with responsibility as fearful eyes turned to me, hoping for a miracle. There, before the immense sea and the imminent threat of a furious army, I raised my staff with trembling hands, crying out to God for deliverance. It was not just a silent prayer, but a fervent cry for help in the face of a desperate situation. "Do not be afraid, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today," I shouted to calm the people and strengthen my own spirit. With faith pulsating in every word, I stretched my hand over the sea. At that moment, a strong east wind began to blow, its powerful gusts cutting across the water's surface. What happened next was a testament to God's incomparable power. The waters of the Red Sea began to part, forming a dry path between two immense walls of water. Encouraged by the miracle before their eyes, the Israelites began to cross the seabed. The sound of millions of feet treading on dry ground blended with the continuous roar of the waters standing beside us. Each step was a step of faith, And as we walked, the fear of being overtaken by the Egyptian army still haunted us. Pharaoh, blinded by anger and despair, ordered his chariots and horsemen to follow us along the miraculously opened path. The rumble of the war chariots echoed behind us, a threatening symphony that increased the urgency of our escape. When the last of the Israelites reached the opposite shore, I turned to see the Egyptian army advancing quickly along the path between the waters. With my heart pounding, I raised my staff again, now in sign of the miracle's completion. As soon as I lowered my arm, the wind ceased abruptly and the waters began to close. Terrified, the Egyptians tried to retreat, but it was too late. The waters closed in with violent force, engulfing chariots, horsemen, and horses. The sound of their armor and cries vanished beneath the roar of the waters, returning to their place. We on the other side watched in reverent and astonished silence, aware of the terrible but necessary act of divine justice. As the sea calmed, returning to its normal vastness, with no sign of the army that pursued us, relief and gratitude erupted among the people. Praises and songs of victory were sung, led by my sister Miriam. The women danced with tambourines, and the air was filled with music and joy, celebrating our salvation and the mighty hand of God that had liberated us for good. Crossing the Red Sea was not only an escape from oppression, but a baptism of faith and the birth of a nation under divine protection. That event was etched into our collective memory, an eternal reminder of God's power and unwavering faithfulness. I, Moses, leading the people on that journey, felt a transformation within me, solidifying my role as a leader and servant of a God who fulfills his promises in ways that challenge human imagination. The silence that followed the closing of the Red Sea was profound, almost sacred. The magnitude of what had just occurred weighed on us, a people who had witnessed a miracle of divine proportions. Faced with that moment, I, Moses, felt an overwhelming urge to express the gratitude and reverence filling my heart. It wasn't enough just to speak. The grandeur of our deliverance demanded a celebration that transcended words. Moved by the Spirit of God, I began to sing a song, a melody that spontaneously flowed from my soul. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea. My voice, laden with emotion and strength, rose above the people's murmurs, capturing the essence of our liberation and the incomparable power of our God. As the words flowed, the people joined me, each voice adding to a powerful chorus that spread along the sea's shores. The women, led by my sister Miriam, took tambourines and danced, their movements marking the rhythm of our collective gratitude. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him, my fathers. God, and I will exalt him. The song narrated not just the crossing, but also God's promise to bring us to the land he had sworn to our ancestors. You, in your mercy, have led forth the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them in your strength to your holy habitation. It was a sung prophecy, a vision of the future God had promised us, full of hope and blessings. As the song grew in intensity, we reflected on God's power over nations, on how he had fought for us against Egypt. The peoples will hear and be afraid. Sorrow will take hold of the inhabitants of Philistia. It was a reminder that the divine protection we had experienced would continue with us as we advanced to conquer the promised land. Each verse of the song also served as a reminder for future generations. It was a declaration of God's faithfulness and power, an affirmation that no enemy could prevail against us while under his guard. The Lord shall reign forever and ever, we sang, a proclamation of God's eternal sovereignty over our destiny. The song reached its climax with a celebration of God's justice, which had turned the sea into an instrument of salvation for his people and destruction for their enemies. And so, To the sound of tambourines, dances, and songs, our people expressed an uncontrollable joy. The Song of Moses, as it came to be known, was more than a song. It was an oral monument to divine intervention in our history. It was a hymn that strengthened our faith and solidified our identity as God's chosen people. A hymn that would be passed down from generation to generation. On that day, the shores of the Red Sea became an open-air sanctuary where heaven and earth seemed to unite in praise. We, a liberated people, sang not just for physical liberation, but for spiritual liberation, celebrating God's constant presence and promise in our lives. After the euphoria of crossing the Red Sea and the victory song, the reality of our journey through the desert began to impose itself upon us. I, Moses, led a people who carried not only freedom, but also human needs and frailties. In the desert, far from the sustaining structures of Egypt, the first complaints arose. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat and ate bread to the full, they lamented. Fear and uncertainty corroding the newly strengthened faith. Murmurings spread like a disease among the tribes. They complained of hunger and thirst, fearing that their liberation had only led to a slow and agonizing death in the desert. My own faith was tested, but I knew that each challenge was also an opportunity for God to reveal His providence and strengthen our trust in Him. I cried out to God in desperation, seeking guidance and intervention. The response came as miraculously as the plagues that had afflicted Egypt. "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you," God promised, instructing that each man should gather according to what he could eat. The promise of manna, a substance fine as frost, was the guarantee that God would not abandon us. The next morning, like a delicate covering over the ground, manna lay around the camp. Upon seeing the manna, many did not know what it was. "Manhu," they asked, which means, "What is it?" I explained that it was the bread the Lord had given to feed us. Day after day, manna fell with the morning dew, and each family gathered enough for the day, a daily reminder of dependence and faith. However, thirst soon became our next great challenge. At Rephidim, the cry for water became desperate, and complaints rose again, reaching such intensity that I feared for my safety. "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and livestock with thirst?" They confronted me with bitterness and despair. Once again in anguish, I brought our needs before God. He instructed me to take the staff with which I had struck the waters of the Nile and go to the rock at Horeb. "Strike the rock, and water will come out of it so that the people may drink." Following the divine instructions, I struck the rock with the force of my faith. Incredibly, fresh and clear water flowed from the rock, enough to quench everyone's thirst. The miracle of water from the rock was more than just provision. It was a physical manifestation of God's continual and caring presence among us. With each challenging step, each need met, our faith was shaped, strengthened against the harsh realities of the desert. These events, manna from heaven and water from the rock, became fundamental not only for our physical survival, but spiritual survival. They were daily reminders that our dependence was not on what is earthly and fleeting, but on the eternal and inexhaustible God of Israel. Reflecting on these miracles, I deeply understood that leading was not just about guiding a people through physical geography, but navigating the complex landscapes of faith and doubt, fear and hope. Each miracle, each provision, each response to our complaints was not just to calm hungry stomachs and dry throats, but to cultivate a spirit of trust and devotion to God. Thus, in the vast and inhospitable desert, we found the true substance of our freedom, not just the absence of physical shackles, but the constant and sustaining presence of the God who liberated us. And each morning, as we gathered manna, and each time we drank from miraculous springs, we were reminded that true sustenance comes from faithfully following the one who called us to freedom. After the miraculous provisions of manna and water, our spirits were revitalized, but we soon faced a new challenge. As we marched through the desert, a threat emerged in our path. Amalek, a warrior people, decided to attack us. Moses knew that we were not only on a physical journey, but also in a constant state of spiritual battle. Faced with this threat, I knew we needed both a physical and spiritual strategy. I appointed Joshua, a strong and valiant young man, to lead our fighters. Choose capable men and go out to fight Amalek tomorrow, I instructed. Joshua, with determination in his eyes, accepted the task without hesitation, preparing for the approaching conflict. The next morning, as Joshua and the men positioned themselves on the battlefield, I climbed to the top of a nearby hill, accompanied by Aaron and Hur. I knew my place was not on the front lines, but in a position where my faith and leadership could be most effective. As I watched the two armies meet in the valley below, I raised my hands to the sky, a gesture of supplication and dependence on God's power. With my hands raised, I felt energy pass through me, a direct connection with the divine, strengthening our warriors in the field. The battle was fierce, and I could see that whenever my hands remained raised, Israel prevailed. However, the weight of my arms began to be felt, and each time I lowered my hands, even for a moment, the tide of battle shifted, and Amalek gained the upper hand. Aaron and Hur, observing the effect of my raised hands, quickly came to help. They brought a stone for me to sit on, and each positioned themselves by my side, holding my arms, supporting them firmly in the air. This image of the three of us, united on the hilltop, was a powerful reminder of the strength that comes from unity and mutual support. With my arms supported by my brothers, the battle continued throughout the day, and the determination of Joshua and the Israelite fighters, along with our continual intercession, eventually led to our victory over Amalek. The victory came not just through weapons, but was clearly attributed to God's power, manifested through our faith and perseverance. After the battle, exhausted but deeply grateful, I built an altar on the site which I called "The Lord is my banner." This name was a permanent testimony that in all of life's battles, our victory depends not just on our strength or strategy, but on God's presence with us. At the altar, I reflected on the lesson of that day, the importance of leadership that relies on dependence on God and community support. I declared that a hand would continuously be raised against Amalek from generation to generation, symbolizing the ongoing struggle between good and evil, and the perpetual need to remain vigilant and dependent on the higher power. This battle against the Amalekites was not just an isolated event in our journey, but a crucial part of our maturation as a nation under God. It would teach future generations the importance of active faith and community support, reinforcing that even in the most intense adversities, God's presence is a banner under which we can safely gather. After the victory over the Amalekites and many days of relentless challenges in the desert, I received news that warmed my heart amid our arduous journey. Jethro, my father-in-law, was coming to meet us, accompanied by Zipporah, my wife, and my two sons, Gershom and Eliezer, who had remained under his care. Jethro brought with him not only my family, but also a perspective that would fundamentally change the way I led our people. On the day of his arrival, I prepared to receive him with all the honor that a priest of Midian deserved. His presence among us was a cause for celebration. After a warm reunion with my family, I took Jethro to show him the camp and share with him the many miracles God had performed for us, from the exodus from Egypt to the recent provisions of manna and water. During his visit, Jethro observed closely how I managed the people. From dawn until dusk, I sat to judge between the people, resolving disputes and interpreting God's laws. The lines were long and the work exhausting. Perceiving my fatigue and the burden I carried alone, Jethro approached with a look of concern. "What you are doing is not good," he said gently but firmly. "Surely you will wear out both yourself and these people with you. The task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone." The truth of his words struck me with a force I did not expect, making me realize the weight I imposed on myself and the inefficiency of our system. Jethro then advised me to seek capable men among all the people, men who feared God, were trustworthy, and hated dishonest gain. "They can be officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens," he explained. "These men could judge the minor cases, lightening my load, while the more difficult cases would be brought to me." The wisdom of this proposal was undeniable. The next day, with a grateful heart and a mind renewed by clarity, I followed Jethro's advice. We selected men of integrity from among the tribes and appointed them as leaders of various groups, establishing a system of governance that proved effective and sustainable. Jethro, seeing that his advice had been implemented and that the new structure was working well, prepared to return to Midian. Before his departure, we offered a sacrifice to God, and he, along with Aaron and the elders of Israel, participated in a sacred meal before the Lord, sealing our mutual gratitude and respect. The farewell was touching. As he left, I felt a deep gratitude for having a mentor and father like Jethro, whose visit not only relieved my burden, but also strengthened the bonds of our community and deepened our ability to govern with justice and efficiency. From that day on, with the new structure in place, I could dedicate more time to prayer, teaching God's law, and planning for Israel's future. Jethro taught me that a true leader does not bear all responsibilities alone, but empowers others to lead together. After months of traveling through the desert, we arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai, a place that would soon become central to our journey and faith. The mountain rose majestically against a blue horizon, and a sense of solemnity spread among the people. Moses felt a divine calling stronger than ever, a summons to ascend that mountain and meet directly with God. In the 3rd month after our exodus from Egypt, God spoke to me from the top of Sinai. His voice resounded like thunder, piercing the desert silence. "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." The magnitude of those words enveloped me, reinforcing the seriousness of what was about to happen. Preparing the people for this sacred encounter, I instructed everyone to purify and sanctify themselves for 3 days. The boundaries around the mountain were marked. No Israelite was to touch it, under penalty of death. The anticipation grew as the mountain smoked, enveloped by God's glory, like a great consuming fire at the top. At dawn on the 3rd day, thunder and lightning pierced the sky, and a trumpet sounded, growing louder, announcing my ascent. The people watched, trembling at the mountain's foot, as I began the solitary climb through the thick cloud covering. Sinai. At the top, God delivered to me the laws and commandments, the foundations of our covenant and our life as His chosen people. The words I received were profound and wide-ranging, detailed instructions on how to live justly, worship properly, and maintain the community. Among these laws were the 10 Commandments, unchanging principles that would guide our behavior and spirituality. I descended the mountain with the stone tablets in my hands, carrying the physical weight of the law and the spiritual weight of responsibility. I presented the tablets to the people, who solemnly accepted to commit to this new covenant. "All that the Lord has said, we will do," they responded in unison, sealing the pact with their acceptance. In the days that followed, I ascended Sinai. Multiple times, each ascent marked by new revelations and instructions. During one of these extended periods on the mountain, I received details about the tabernacle, the altar, and the rituals that would bring us closer to God. These laws covered everything from the design of priestly garments to the standards for sacrifices, essential elements for our worship and communion with the divine. On one of my last descents, I brought with me detailed instructions for constructing the tabernacle, a tangible symbol of God's presence among us. I shared these instructions with skilled artisans and leaders of the people who would dedicate themselves to building this sacred sanctuary. However, my longest stay on the mountain occurred when I spent 40 days and 40 nights without eating or drinking, completely enveloped in the presence of God. It was a period of deep communion and continuous reception of divine law, a time that strengthened my spirit and solidified my commitment to the mission God had entrusted to me. After days of intense communion with God at the top of Mount Sinai, I was about to descend, carrying the tablets of the law inscribed by the finger of God himself. These laws were the foundation of the new life that God proposed for the people of Israel, a path of righteousness and exclusive worship to him. However, as I approached the camp, a tumultuous and chaotic sound grew in my ears, a sound that did not align with the reverence those sacred laws demanded. My heart sank when I saw from afar the scene unfolding below. Instead of praying and worshiping the God who had miraculously freed them, the people were gathered around a gleaming figure, dancing and singing in unrestrained celebration. As I drew closer, the shock of what I saw almost knocked me down. A golden calf, forged from the ornaments they had brought from Egypt. Anger and sadness invaded me simultaneously. How could they so quickly forget the wonders God had performed? How could they stray so drastically from the path he had set for us? At the height of my despair and indignation, I threw the stone tablets to the ground, shattering them at the foot of the mountain, symbolizing the breaking of the covenant the people had so quickly violated. Enraged and heartbroken, I advanced through the crowd until I reached the golden calf. With my own hands, I removed the idol from its pedestal, casting it into the fire to melt it completely. I then ground the melted metal to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the people drink it. It was a symbolic act, forcing them to internalize the gravity of their sin. The magnitude of their betrayal demanded a severe response. I called before me all who remained loyal to God, and instructed them to go through the camp and punish those responsible for idolatry. That day, about 3,000 men were killed, a terrible but necessary act to purify the people of their great transgression and restore the order and reverence that God's presence demanded. Faced with the gravity of the events, I returned to the mountain to intercede for the people. My soul was anguished by the possibility that God might decide to destroy us all because of this heinous sin. I spent nights in fervent prayer, pleading for mercy, offering even my own life in atonement for Israel's sin. God, in his infinite mercy and justice, decided not to completely destroy the people, but the consequences of their actions would still persist. "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book," he declared, and a plague afflicted the people as a sign of his displeasure with the grave offense committed. This event became a somber milestone in our journey, a constant reminder of how easily the human heart can stray. It also reinforced the need for firm leadership and constant vigilance against the temptations of idolatry and disobedience. The tablets of the law were remade, and the covenant was renewed, but the memory of the golden calf remained with us. It became a symbol of the dangers of infidelity and the crucial importance of staying faithful to God's commandments, no matter the circumstances. After the painful episode of the golden calf, a sense of sorrow and repentance permeated the people. I, Moses, felt an overwhelming responsibility on my shoulders, knowing that to rebuild trust between God and Israel, we needed to re-establish the covenant that had been broken. God instructed me to chisel 2 stone tablets like the first ones. and ascend again to Mount Sinai for a solemn and restorative encounter. In the quiet of the morning before dawn, I prepared the new tablets and began the solitary ascent, carrying the physical weight of the stones and the spiritual weight of the hope for renewal. Upon reaching the top, I placed the tablets before me, and a deep serenity enveloped the environment, as if nature itself awaited the rewriting of the sacred law. God descended in a cloud and stood there with me. He proclaimed his name and passed before me, revealing his nature and attributes. The Lord God, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Each word resonated with power and grace, filling the air with an almost palpable presence of holiness. As I stood there, before the manifestation of God's glory, I felt a mixture of awe and worship. It was a moment of divine revelation that would transcend generations. Boldly, I seized the opportunity of the divine presence to intercede for the people. I asked that his presence continue with us, despite our failures, so that we could truly be distinguished as his people among all the nations of the earth. God responded to my intercession with promises of renewal and miracles. He promised to drive out the nations before us and establish a vast territory, as he had promised to our ancestors. However, with these promises came stern warnings against idolatry and clear instructions not to make covenants with the inhabitants of the land to which we were going. While I was with God, he rewrote the 10 Commandments on the tablets I had prepared. It was a symbolic and literal act of renewing the covenant, a confirmation that despite Israel's failings, God was still willing to guide and shape his people. When I descended the mountain after 40 days and 40 nights, carrying the rewritten tablets, my face shone due to the encounter with the divine. This radiance initially frightened the people, but they soon understood it was a sign of God's glorious presence with me. To speak with them, I covered my face with a veil, which I only removed when entering the tent to speak with God and when conveying his instructions to the people. This period of intense communion on Sinai marked a new phase in our journey. The rewritten tablets and additional instructions served as a foundation for our continuity as a community that followed God not just in obedience, but with a deep understanding of his mercy, justice, and unwavering love. After receiving the laws and reconfirming our covenant with God on Mount Sinai, I was tasked with a monumental assignment that would symbolize God's continuous presence among us, the construction of the tabernacle. This would not be a mere place of worship, but a physical manifestation of the divine dwelling among his people. The responsibility was immense, and the sense of purpose filled every moment of my being. God presented me with detailed instructions. Each component of the tabernacle had specific meaning and purpose, from the place of sacrifices to the Ark of the Covenant, which would house the tablets of the law. The precision of the details was crucial, for every aspect of the tabernacle had to reflect divine holiness and perfection. The entire community was involved in the construction. It was a collective effort that required not only skill and dedication, but also a spirit of holiness and worship. I instructed Bezalel and Oholiab, 2 extremely talented craftsmen, to lead the project. They were endowed by God himself with skill, intelligence, and knowledge in all kinds of craftsmanship to execute the works as he had commanded. As the work progressed, I oversaw every detail, from the casting of gold for the ark's covering to the weaving of the curtains that would separate the Holy of Holies where the ark would be placed. The community offered precious materials: gold, silver, bronze, fine linen, animal skins, each contributing as their heart moved them. It was a tangible demonstration of their commitment to the Lord and the sanctuary that would symbolize his presence. The construction of the tabernacle was also accompanied by the establishment of the priesthood. Aaron, my brother, was consecrated as the first high priest, along with his sons.